Ethan Rain hated waiting. He tapped his foot impatiently against the metal floor of Vixora Prime's largest spaceport, his sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd. The place was a chaotic mess, filled with beings of all shapes, sizes, and colors. It was the perfect place for someone like him, a scavenger, always looking for his next opportunity to make a few credits. Today, however, was different. Ethan wasn't looking for junk or scrap. He was laying low, hiding from a group of bounty hunters who didn't appreciate him selling faulty starship parts. As he adjusted the hood of his jacket, trying to blend in, his gaze caught something, or someone, he'd never seen before. The woman moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence that made her stand out. She was tall and elegant, her skin a shimmering shade of silver, with faint, glowing lines that pulsed like veins of light. Her sharp, angular face and deep, violet eyes marked her as one of the Talith, a mysterious alien race known for their psychic powers. Ethan had heard the stories. Xalith were dangerous, unpredictable, and avoided most outsiders. Yet this one didn't seem to care about the stares she was getting. Ethan watched as she stopped by a vendor's stall, inspecting a small, glowing object. Her movements were graceful, but her posture was tense, as if she were ready to bolt at any moment. Something about her intrigued Ethan, though he couldn't quite figure out what. Before he could think better of it, he started moving toward her. "Bad idea," he muttered to himself. Just as he was a few steps away, a loud shout broke through the crowd. "There he is." Ethan's heart sank. He turned to see 3 bounty hunters pushing their way through the crowd, blasters drawn. They weren't here to chat. He glanced back at the Salith woman. She had noticed the commotion but hadn't moved. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and Ethan felt a strange chill run down his spine. "Help me out," he said with a nervous grin, half joking. To his surprise, she nodded. With a flick of her hand, the air around Ethan shimmered, and suddenly he was invisible. He stumbled, realizing no one could see him, not even the bounty hunters. They looked around in confusion, shouting orders at each other. "Come with me," the woman said, her voice low but commanding. She grabbed his arm, pulling him through the crowd. Ethan followed, too stunned to argue. She led him through a maze of alleys and into the shadows of the lower levels. When they were finally safe, she released his arm, and the invisibility faded. "Don't thank me," she said, her tone sharp. "And don't get attached. It's safer that way." Ethan grinned, brushing himself off. "You don't know me yet. I'm pretty good at staying alive." The Talith woman turned, her expression unreadable. That's what they all say, until it's too late. Ethan couldn't stop staring at her. The Salith woman had just saved his life, and now they were crouched in the shadows of a rundown hangar. The air smelled like burnt metal, and distant voices echoed through the massive structure as bounty hunters searched for him. "You didn't have to help me," Ethan said, keeping his voice low. "I didn't help you," she replied sharply, her violet eyes glinting in the dim light. "I helped myself. Your little drama was drawing too much attention." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Still, I owe you one. Name's Ethan, by the way." She didn't respond, instead peeking around the corner to check if the coast was clear. "And you are?" he prompted. "Zira," she said reluctantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zira," Ethan repeated with a grin. "Nice to meet you." She turned to him, her expression serious. "This isn't a meet and greet, human. I told you, don't get attached. Stay out of my way, and we won't have a problem." Ethan leaned against the wall, smirking. "Sounds like you've had bad luck with people before." Zira ignored him, her focus shifting to the glowing orb in her hand. It was small, about the size of a fist, and seemed to hum with a faint energy. Ethan's scavenger instincts kicked in immediately. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the orb. "Nothing you need to worry about," she replied, tucking it into a small satchel at her side. Before Ethan could press her for details, heavy footsteps echoed through the hangar. Zira stiffened, and Ethan instinctively reached for the blaster tucked under his jacket. "They're coming," she said. "Yeah, no kidding," Ethan muttered. Zira glanced at him, her expression conflicted. She clearly didn't want to involve him further, but the footsteps were getting closer. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. You can stay for now. But you do exactly what I say." Ethan grinned. "I'm good at following orders." She shot him a doubtful look before motioning for him to follow. The two of them slipped through the shadows, moving deeper into the hangar. Zira's movements were quick and precise, as if she had done this 100 times before. Ethan struggled to keep up, but he wasn't about to complain, not when his life depended on it. Suddenly, one of the bounty hunters appeared ahead of them, blocking their path. He was a massive reptilian creature with razor-sharp claws and a blaster rifle aimed directly at Ethan's chest. "End of the line, human," the bounty hunter growled. Before Ethan could react, Zira stepped forward. Her eyes glowed faintly, and the air around her seemed to ripple. The bounty hunter froze, his weapon clattering to the ground as he clutched his head, groaning in pain. Ethan stared in shock. "What did you just do?" "Saved your life," Zira said coldly. Again. As they fled into the night, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into, and why he felt compelled to stay. Ethan and Zira had found temporary safety in the underbelly of Vixora Prime. They hid inside an old cargo container, its rusted walls barely keeping out the sound of distant engines and shouts. The bounty hunters were still searching for them, but for now, they had a moment to breathe. Ethan sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor, watching as Zira carefully pulled the glowing orb from her satchel. It pulsed softly, casting faint patterns of light on her silver skin. He couldn't take his eyes off it. "That thing is more than just a pretty light, isn't it?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Zira didn't look at him. "It's none of your concern." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Come on, you can't just drag me into this mess and not tell me what's going on. I think I deserve to know what we're running from." She glanced at him, her violet eyes narrowing. "You deserve nothing, human. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ethan smirked. "Maybe. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere until I know what that thing is and why people are willing to kill for it." Zira hesitated, her fingers tightening around the orb. For a moment, she seemed to struggle with herself. Finally, she sighed and held it up, letting the light bathe the small space. "This," she said, her voice low, "is a fragment of the Lumina core, an ancient artifact from a civilization long before any of ours. My people, what's left of them, believe it holds the key to restoring balance to the galaxy." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Balance? That sounds a bit vague." Zira shot him an annoyed look. "The core can tap into the energy of stars. It can reignite a dying one, or destroy an entire system. It depends on who controls it. That's why the Krathar cartel wants it. They'll use it as a weapon." Ethan whistled softly. "No wonder they're after you. But why you? What's your connection to it?" Her expression darkened. "The Salith are linked to this energy. It's part of us. The core responds to me in ways it doesn't respond to anyone else. That's why I can't let them have it." Ethan leaned back, processing what she'd said. "So you're the only one who can use it?" "Not exactly," she replied, her tone bitter. "But I'm the only one willing to use it to protect, not destroy." Before Ethan could ask more, the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside the container. Zira quickly tucked the orb back into her satchel, her body tense. "They're getting closer," she whispered. Ethan reached for his blaster, his heart pounding. "Guess we're not getting much rest tonight." Zira's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "Stick with me, human, and you might survive this. But don't forget, I warned you." Ethan grinned despite the danger. Yeah. Let's see what happens next." The air inside the cargo container was heavy with tension. Zira motioned for Ethan to stay silent as the footsteps grew louder. The bounty hunters were close now, their voices sharp and commanding as they searched the area. Ethan tightened his grip on his blaster, trying to steady his breathing. "Got a plan," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Zira didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes, her silver skin glowing faintly as she focused. The air around them shimmered, and suddenly, Ethan felt a strange, tingling sensation. The space inside the container seemed to shift, and for a moment, it felt as though they weren't really there. "What did you just do?" Ethan whispered, looking around in confusion. "I masked us," Zira replied softly. "They won't see or hear us, if I can hold it." The footsteps stopped right outside the container. Ethan's heart raced as he heard one of the bounty hunters bark an order. The door creaked open, and a massive figure stepped inside. It was Vark, a reptilian brute with dark green scales and a scar running down his face. He sniffed the air, his yellow eyes scanning the room. "They were here," Vark growled. "I can smell the human." Another hunter stepped in, a tall insectoid alien with chitinous armor and multiple eyes. "Maybe they've moved on. We don't have time to search every container." Vark let out a low snarl, his claws scraping against the metal wall. "The boss wants that Salith alive. We're not leaving until we find her." Ethan held his breath, watching as the hunters prowled around the container. Zira's hands trembled slightly, and he could see the strain on her face. Whatever energy she was using to hide them, it was taking a toll. The insectoid alien clicked its mandibles. "Let's move. They're not here." Vark hesitated, then slammed his fist against the wall in frustration. "Fine. But if we lose them, it's on you." As the two bounty hunters left, Zira released the energy, and the shimmering effect disappeared. She staggered slightly, catching herself against the wall. Ethan moved to help her, but she waved him off. "I'm fine," she said, her voice strained. "Fine. You look like you just ran a marathon," Ethan replied, his tone lighter than he felt. "That was impressive, though." Zira shot him a warning glance. "It's not something I can do often. We need to keep moving." Ethan nodded, peeking out of the container to make sure the coast was clear. The hangar was quiet now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The bounty hunters were relentless, and he doubted they'd give up easily. "Where to next?" he asked. Zira pulled out a small device from her satchel, a holographic map flickering to life in her hand. "There's a shipyard on the outskirts of the city. If we can get there, we might find transport off this planet." "Might," Ethan repeated, raising an eyebrow. Zira smirked faintly. "You wanted adventure, didn't you?" Ethan laughed despite himself. "Lead the way, glowing lady." With one last glance at the hangar, they slipped into the shadows, the chase far from over. Ethan and Zira moved quickly through the labyrinth of Vixera Prime's industrial district. The air was thick with smoke from factories, and the faint hum of machinery created a constant background noise. The glowing lights of distant hovercrafts illuminated the night, but neither of them dared stop to enjoy the view. "How much farther is this shipyard?" Ethan asked, his voice low but edged with impatience. "Not far," Zira replied without looking at him. Her tone was clipped, but Ethan could sense the weariness in her steps. The energy she'd used to mask them earlier had clearly taken its toll. He jogged a little to catch up to her. "You sure you're okay? You look like you're running on fumes." "I'm fine," she said sharply, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Ethan didn't push her further. He had seen enough to know she wasn't one to admit weakness. Still, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder made him uneasy. As they approached a narrow alley, Zira suddenly froze. Her violet eyes widened, and her hand shot out to grab Ethan's arm, pulling him back into the shadows. "Hey," Ethan protested, but her glare silenced him. "Quiet," she whispered. Peering around the corner, Ethan saw what had stopped her. A group of bounty hunters stood near the entrance to the shipyard. Vark was among them, barking orders to the others. "They've blocked the main entrance," Zira muttered, her voice tinged with frustration. Ethan's mind raced. "So what's the plan? Sneak around? Fight? Or do you have another one of those fancy tricks up your sleeve?" Zira hesitated. "If I use my abilities again, I might not recover in time to get us out of here. But there's no other way." Ethan stepped in front of her, shaking his head. "Hold on. You've already done enough. Let me handle this one." She frowned. "You? Against them? That's suicide." "Maybe," Ethan said with a crooked grin. "But I've gotten out of tighter spots before. Besides, you've got that glowing orb thing. If something happens to me, you can still make it out." Zira looked at him, her expression softening for the first time. "Why would you do that? Risk your life for someone you barely know?" Ethan shrugged, his grin fading into something more sincere. "Maybe I don't need a reason, or maybe I just think you're worth it." For a moment, Zira seemed at a loss for words. She looked away, her fingers brushing against the satchel that held the orb. "You shouldn't care about me, Ethan. I warned you. Getting close to me is dangerous." "Yeah, you mentioned that," Ethan said, his voice calm. "But it's my choice." Zira sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine. But don't get yourself killed. I might actually feel bad about it." Ethan winked. "Deal." As he slipped into the shadows, Zira couldn't help but feel the bond between them growing stronger and more dangerous. Ethan moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as he made his way around the shipyard. The bounty hunters were still gathered near the main entrance, blocking the way. His heart was racing, but his mind stayed focused. This wasn't his first time sneaking around danger, but it had never felt like this before. Zira's warning echoed in his head, "Don't get attached." But here he was, risking everything for her. He ducked behind a stack of crates, peeking around the corner. He had to find a way to draw the bounty hunters away from the entrance long enough for Zira to slip through. She was counting on him. "Now or never," Ethan muttered to himself. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small explosive device he'd scavenged a few days earlier. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to create a distraction. He pressed the button, sending the device into a countdown. With a deep breath, Ethan dashed to the far side of the yard, where a stack of scrap metal lay in a loose pile. He grabbed a nearby pole and knocked it over, creating a loud crash. The sound rang through the shipyard like an alarm. "Hey, what was that?" one of the bounty hunters shouted. Ethan grinned, quickly slipping behind another stack of crates. The hunters were on the move now, rushing toward the noise. It was his chance. He sprinted across the yard, careful to keep low, until he reached the far corner, where a small, hidden door led into a narrow alley. His heart pounded as he pushed it open. "Come on, Zira," he whispered, glancing behind him. The sound of the explosion echoed through the yard as the distraction worked. The bounty hunter's attention was fully diverted. Ethan's mind raced. Would Zira make it? He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to get her to the sanctuary. He darted into the alley, running as fast as he could. There was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Zira stood at the edge of the shipyard, watching as Ethan made his move. Her heart was heavy with worry, and for the first time in a long while, she felt conflicted. She knew she was putting him in danger. He was just a human, and she had warned him. But even so, his willingness to fight for her, was something she wasn't used to. She couldn't deny it, though. The bond between them was growing stronger, and it scared her. With a final glance toward the main entrance, Zira pushed open a small door at the back of the shipyard. It led into a narrow tunnel, one that only the Salith knew about. The tunnel led to a hidden sanctuary, a place where her people had once lived in secret. It had been abandoned for years, but Zira hoped it would offer them some safety. As she moved deeper into the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow darker than the last. The orb in her satchel pulsed with energy, as though it were reacting to her anxiety. When Zira finally emerged into the sanctuary, she paused, taking in the surroundings. The stone walls were covered in strange symbols, remnants of a past that had been lost to time. The place had been forgotten by most of the galaxy, but it was home to the last of the Talith, a secret they had worked hard to protect. She turned back to the tunnel, waiting for Ethan. She just hoped he would make it. Ethan's breath came in quick gasps as he sprinted through the shipyard. The explosion had created chaos, and the bounty hunters had scattered in different directions. But as he ducked behind another stack of crates, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He glanced around, trying to stay hidden, his mind racing. Where's Zira? He had done his part. He had drawn the hunters away, but now he needed to catch up with her. The plan had been simple enough. Create a distraction and meet at the hidden sanctuary. Yet there was a strange feeling in the air, a sense that things weren't going as smoothly as they should have been. Ethan moved toward the back of the shipyard, hoping to find the entrance to the hidden tunnel. His eyes scanned the shadows, and just as he turned a corner, he saw a familiar figure. But it wasn't Zira. It was a man, tall and cloaked in black. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and his presence felt like a shadow in the darkness. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Looking for someone. The man's voice was cold, cutting through the silence. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his blaster, but the man raised his hand. Don't bother, human. It won't do you any good. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Who are you? The man took a step forward, revealing a small emblem on his chest, an insignia that Ethan recognized instantly. It was the symbol of the Krathar cartel. You're with them, Ethan growled. What are you doing here? The man smiled darkly. I could ask you the same thing, but I'm afraid you're asking the wrong questions. You're too late, human. Before Ethan could react, the man gestured with a flick of his wrist. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he looked up to see a massive ship hovering above them, its engines roaring to life. It wasn't just any ship. It was the Krathar cartel's flagship. Ethan's mind raced. The cartel was here, but how had they found them so quickly? You've walked into a trap, the man said with a hint of amusement in his voice. Zira never planned to meet you. She led you right into our hands. Ethan's stomach dropped. What do you mean? She told me she was taking us to safety. The man laughed softly, a cruel sound. Safety? You think she cares about you? She's been using you, human, all along. She needed someone to draw the hunters away, and you were the perfect pawn. She's always known where to find us, but you've been following her blind. And now, it's too late. Ethan's blood ran cold. You're lying. She wouldn't. I'm afraid it's the truth, the man interrupted. But don't worry. You'll be of use to us soon enough. Once we finish with Zira, you'll be next. Ethan's hands shook with anger, his mind in turmoil. Was it true? Had Zira betrayed him? Before he could gather his thoughts, a loud explosion echoed in the distance. The entire shipyard shook, and the sound of blaster fire filled the air. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. Zira. Without thinking, he turned and ran toward the source of the chaos, his thoughts racing. He had to find her. He had to know the truth. The explosion had been close, too close. Ethan's pulse hammered in his chest as he sprinted through the smoke and debris, the sounds of battle filling the air. He didn't know who was shooting or who was attacking, but one thought was clear in his mind. Zira. He had to find her. The Krathar cartel's flagship loomed above, its massive shadow casting a dark pall over the shipyard. The bounty hunters, once scattered, had regrouped and were now taking positions, firing into the smoke, trying to catch whatever enemy had dared to make a move. But Ethan didn't care about them anymore. He pushed forward, ignoring the danger, his eyes scanning the chaos. Finally, he saw her. Zira stood in the middle of the yard, her silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't even moving. She stood perfectly still, as though she was waiting. Ethan's heart sank. What was she doing? Zira, he shouted, rushing toward her. At the sound of his voice, her head snapped toward him, her violet eyes wide. She didn't look surprised, almost as if she had been expecting him. But there was something else in her gaze, something he couldn't place. Ethan skidded to a stop in front of her, his eyes searching her face. What the hell is going on? The cartel's here, and you. What are you doing? Zira's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she raised her hand, the orb from her satchel pulsing brightly. Ethan stepped back instinctively, feeling the air around them shift. He could feel it, too, the energy, the same strange sensation he'd felt when she used her powers before, only this time it was stronger, much stronger. Zira, what is that? Ethan asked, his voice strained. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were focused on the orb, her expression distant, as though she was seeing something far beyond the shipyard. The pulsing light from the orb cast eerie shadows on her face. Her breath came in shallow gasps, as though she were struggling to control something. This is too much, she whispered, barely audible. I didn't think it would react like this. What's happening? What did you do? Ethan demanded. Zira's eyes flicked to him, and for the briefest moment, he saw a flicker of fear. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something else. Something darker, something that chilled him to the bone. It's the orb, Zira said, her voice tight. It's not just a tool. It's a part of me. Ethan's brow furrowed. What? What are you talking about? The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and suddenly, the air was filled with a powerful hum. Ethan staggered, gripping the nearest crate to keep his balance. Zira's hands were trembling now, her focus split between the orb and the chaos around them. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted you to get involved. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop myself. Ethan stared at her, unable to comprehend what was happening. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of battle fading into the background as a wave of energy rippled through the yard. It was coming from Zira and the orb. Zira, he said softly, his voice full of concern. What have you done? I've awakened it, she replied, her eyes filled with both awe and fear. And now, there's no turning back. Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift again, the air growing thick with energy. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a force that was growing stronger by the second. Zira was no longer just a woman he had been following. She was something else entirely, something dangerous. And now, Ethan realized the truth. He wasn't just in danger. They both were. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet as Zira stood frozen, the orb's energy swirling around her like a storm. He felt it too, the raw power that radiated from her. The world around them seemed to vibrate with energy, and the distant sounds of blaster fire and shouting faded into a dull hum. Zira, you have to stop, Ethan shouted, but his words barely cut through the noise. His heart raced, his eyes locked on her as she stood in the center of the chaos, her body trembling with the force of the power she had unleashed. I can't, Zira whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to control it anymore. Ethan's stomach twisted. The woman he had come to trust, the one who had warned him, who had kept him safe, was no longer in control. The orb, that strange object that had brought them together, had overwhelmed her, and now it was threatening to destroy everything. Behind them, the roar of the Krathar cartel's forces grew louder. Vark, the massive reptilian hunter, had reappeared, leading the charge. His deep voice boomed as he barked orders at his men. We take her now. We'll break her. The core will be ours. Ethan turned, his hand tightening around the grip of his blaster. He didn't have time for any more games. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, how much longer Zira could keep this up. Zira, listen to me, he yelled, stepping forward. His voice was urgent, desperate. "We can stop this. We can still get out of here." She shook her head, her eyes blank as if the light from the orb had taken away all her focus. "I'm not the one who needs to stop, Ethan. It's too late. It's already started." Before Ethan could respond, the air around them suddenly cracked like thunder, and a wave of energy exploded from the orb. Ethan was thrown back, slamming into the ground as the world around him distorted. He tried to push himself up, but the energy was too much. He could feel the heat of it, the power, as if the very fabric of the universe was bending to the will of the orb. He heard Zira scream, but it was faint, distant. The cartel soldiers, those who had remained standing, staggered as the energy wave struck them. Some of them were thrown into the air, others dropped to their knees, clutching their heads in pain. But Vark was still standing. He had dug his claws into the ground, his face twisted with rage. "No," Vark roared. "She will not control the core. I will." Vark charged forward, his massive form charging toward Zira. Ethan knew he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Ignoring the pounding in his chest and the dizzying energy in the air, Ethan grabbed his blaster, aimed, and fired. The blast hit Vark square in the chest, sending him sprawling back. His claws scraped across the ground as he tried to steady himself, but the energy from the orb had taken its toll. The cartel leader groaned, his eyes clouding with fury. Zira's eyes snapped toward Ethan. She seemed to focus for a brief moment, as if the connection between them had cleared the fog in her mind. She reached out with one trembling hand. "Ethan, get back," she cried. But it was too late. The orb was too powerful now. The cartel was closing in, and the stakes were higher than ever. The future of the galaxy rested on what happened next. Ethan barely had time to react. The energy from the orb surged again, and the air crackled with a violent force. His body felt like it was being pulled in all directions as Zira, with all her strength, pushed the orb's power to its limit. She was struggling, her body shaking, her face pale, but her resolve was clear. The cartel soldiers had regrouped, but the wave of energy that Zira had unleashed had left them disoriented, scrambling to regain control. Vark, though, was still standing. He was wounded, his armor scorched from Ethan's blaster shot, but his anger fueled him. "Enough," Vark shouted, charging again, his massive form moving faster than Ethan expected. The cartel leader's claws gleamed under the harsh light of the orb. Ethan's heart raced. He had to stop him. He had to protect Zira. Ignoring the pain from the blast earlier, Ethan lunged forward. The moment felt like slow motion as he aimed his blaster at Vark, but before he could fire, a burst of energy from the orb flared up, creating a barrier between him and the cartel leader. Zira's voice broke through the chaos. "Ethan, stay back. You don't know what it will do." But it was too late. The energy had already taken on a life of its own. The barrier between Ethan and Vark solidified, glowing with an almost blinding light. The force from the orb was pushing everything away, keeping both enemies at bay. The cartel soldiers hesitated. They knew that their leader was powerful, but the energy in the air felt like nothing they had ever encountered. Vark, undeterred, tried to press forward, but Zira's voice rang out again, more forceful this time. "This is my fight, Vark." With one final push, she channeled every ounce of strength into the orb. The energy pulse that followed was unlike anything Ethan had seen. It was as if the universe itself had bent to her will. The cartel soldiers stumbled back, some of them falling to the ground as they tried to shield themselves from the sheer force of the blast. Vark roared in defiance, but it was no use. The energy enveloped him, lifting him off the ground and sending him crashing into the wall of the shipyard, his body unconscious from the sheer power. Ethan was frozen, watching in awe as Zira, despite her exhaustion, held the orb aloft. The power from it was gradually receding, and she staggered forward, her body trembling. She had given everything. She had to stop the cartel. "Zira." Ethan rushed to her side, catching her before she collapsed. She looked up at him, her violet eyes tired but relieved. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Ethan, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop them. Ethan gently took her hand, feeling the faint pulse of the orb still humming in the air. You did what you had to. You saved us all. She smiled weakly. I couldn't have done it without you. For a long moment, they stood there, the battle around them having come to an unexpected end. The Krathar cartel was defeated, at least for now, and the immediate danger had passed. But there was more to their journey. Zira's eyes flicked to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to peek through the dark clouds. It's not over, Ethan. The galaxy, it's broken. And the orb is just the beginning. There's so much more we need to fix. Ethan looked at her, his resolve clear. Then let's do it. Together. With that, they turned away from the wreckage of the shipyard and toward the unknown future, where their journey would continue. A journey of hope, of danger, and of discovering the true power of the connection they shared. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to restore balance to the galaxy. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough.